Fire doesn't just burn flesh, it burns memory, legacy. Names carved into stone by the trembling hands of empires, and in the heart of medieval Europe, amid the smoldering chants of Latin prayers and the iron heartbeat of crusading steel, silent power rose from dust-drenched roads to become the most feared and richest brotherhood the Christian world had ever known, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, known to the damned and the devout alike as the Knights Templar, whose white mantles bore the red cross not as a symbol of purity, but as a scarlet oath of vengeance, blood, and divine vengeance. They were warriors and monks, guardians and merchants, crusaders and crypt keepers, a contradiction armored in myth, forged by faith, and sharpened by centuries of war. And their rise was not a tale of divine favor, but of gold-stained hands, whispered deals with kings, and a fortress of silence built upon bones yet in their death. They would not go quietly. They would be consumed not by sword or sin, but by the same fire they had lit across the Levant, a fire stoked by kings they had once served, and by a pope who once kissed their banners. This is Candle and Coffin. Let's uncover the forgotten truth beneath the ashes of history. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far this story travels. They began as ghosts in the Holy Land, nameless shadows on the edge of a broken war, 9 knights without fortune, country, or command, drifting through the scorched remains of the first crusade like exiles in white linen. Their armor dented not by glory, but by hunger. Their horses lean from famine. Their spirits tethered not to kings, but to a cause carved in fire. Protect the pilgrims, or die trying. And so in the year of our Lord 1119, under the searing sun of Jerusalem and in the burned-out ruins of Solomon's temple, these 9 gathered in silence, no gold, no land, just blood and oaths, led by Hugues Depans, a French noble with the bearing of a soldier and the soul of a penitent, who offered not riches but sacrifice, not conquest but protection, swearing to live without wives, without children, without pride, owning nothing, wielding everything. And from the cracked stone altar rose the original rule: humility, poverty, obedience. Yet it would not last, for what they lacked in silver, they gained in favor. Catching the eyes of the powerful, Baldwin II, the king of Jerusalem, offered them quarters atop the Temple Mount, placing the sacred and the strategic in the same breath, while the church in Rome, ever watchful of divine momentum, whispered blessings over these new warrior monks. And thus the seed was planted, not in peace, but in contradiction. A brotherhood that vowed to reject the world, but would soon come to own vast swaths of it, all while draped in silence, cloaked in divine legality, and wrapped in armor that bore not the sheen of glory, but the soot of something deeper, something darker, something inevitable. They had begun with no coin and no home, but within a generation, the Knights Templar held more wealth than some kings, and more fear than most armies. For what began as a vow of poverty, and the scorched alleys of Jerusalem transformed, almost imperceptibly, into a machine of divine finance and silent domination, stretching across continents like ivy over a forgotten tomb, as pilgrims flooded to the Holy Land, desperate for safe passage through the bloodied roads of Crusader territory. The Templars offered protection not just with swords, but with scrolls, letters of credit, sealed in Latin, honored across Europe, and the Levant, an early shadow of banking, where gold moved without ever changing hands. And with it came power, the kind that wore no crown but made kings kneel nonetheless. From Paris to Antioch, from London to Acre, their fortresses rose like stone prayers, each one doubling as a treasury, a military hub, and a house of secrets, while their red cross became more than a symbol. It was a brand, feared, worshipped. Envy they answered to no king but God, and yet they collected debts from kings like merchants collecting taxes, their riders moving between nations unmolested, untaxed, protected by the church's blessing and the sword's deterrent. In Rome, the papacy, ever hungry for muscle it could call its own, granted them unheard of privileges, exemption from local laws, from tithes, from punishment. Only the Pope himself could judge them, and so the Order of the Temple ceased to be mere warriors and became something more terrible, a sovereign force beneath the skin of Christendom, silent and golden, cloaked in obedience yet manipulating the very powers they once served, all the while training their boys from noble sons to orphan squires in war, theology, an obedience so absolute it became a kind of sacred hypnosis, turning men into instruments, knights into myths, and myths into tools of empire in the cold hush of Templar strongholds beneath chapels. Where candles burned before altars of Christ crucified, there were rooms no pilgrim saw. Chambers beneath stone where voices lowered, rituals deepened, and trust became silence. What once had been born in faith now drew breath in mystery, and as their wealth grew, so did the rumors, flitting like ghosts through Europe's courts, rumors of strange oaths, of symbols carved in vaults not written in Latin, but in something older, more pagan, more Eastern. Some said they bowed not to Christ alone, but to a severed head, a relic passed hand to hand in sacred secrecy, whispered to be the Baphomet, neither man nor beast, neither saint nor devil, but something else entirely, and whether it was truth or slander mattered little, for the seeds had been planted, and Europe, always ready to turn piety into pyres, began to watch them differently. In the Holy Land, the Templars had fought alongside Saracens when strategy demanded it, had sat in councils with Muslim emirs when survival required it, and this mingling, this willingness to see beyond the dogmas of Christendom, made them dangerous. Not just powerful, but ambiguous, and ambiguity was heresy's favorite garment. In their rites, some claimed, initiates spat upon the cross as a test of obedience. Others claimed they worshipped knowledge above doctrine, or protected gospels the church had buried, all unproven, all denied, but all believed by the kind of men who rule with fear and suspicion. And in France, a king watched, listened, and began to plan. For when a monarch is drowning in debt, the most convenient enemy is always the one who lent him gold. And the Templars had lent more than most could ever repay, so as they built their fortresses higher, sealed their vaults deeper, and swore themselves again to God in silence. They did not see the noose being braided in the shadows behind the throne. Philip IV of France, Philip the Fair, though his fairness ended at the skin, sat upon a throne, carved from war, marriage, and merciless taxation. A monarch born into a kingdom fractured by ambition and crowned with creditors. And among those creditors none stood taller or more indestructible than the Knights Templar, whose coffers rivaled those of any crown and whose financial web ran deeper than any papal tithe. So when Philip looked upon the map of Christendom, he saw not friends or rivals, but assets to be seized, and the Templars once his protectors. Now his jailers in debt became to him a prison he longed to burn to ash. But how to slay a holy army sworn to God without declaring war on heaven itself? He would need more than swords. He would need rumors, whispers dressed as revelations, a myth of heresy too vile to ignore, and so with a cunning born not of valor, but of desperation, he commissioned spies, bought informants, coaxed confessions from the lips of the broken, and with papal authority hanging in delicate balance, he moved not against them in battle, but in a pre-dawn purge worthy of Rome's darkest emperors. On Friday the 13th of October, 1307, a day whose infamy would echo through centuries, Philip unleashed his vendetta. And across France, in the blackest hours before dawn, Templar doors were smashed, vaults seized, brothers chained, and oaths broken under torchlight. The mightiest order in Christendom was felled not with lances, but with parchment and ink, with sealed orders and silent arrests, as if their loyalty, their sacrifices, their blood spilled in every corner of the Holy Land had been illusions. And now in dungeons once built for thieves, the guardians of Jerusalem sat waiting for a church too scared to save them, and a people too cowed to speak, and so began not just the trial of the Templars, but the trial of memory itself. For what Was truth when kings could write lies in the language of God? They came not with scrolls or scripture, but with branding irons, spiked chairs, and cords soaked in brine, interrogators of the French crown, cloaked in the authority of both king and church, moving like ghosts through the stone corridors of makeshift prisons, where the walls bled with screams never meant to see daylight. Here, in the damp blackness beneath Paris and Chinon, the Knights Templar, once Knights of the Cross, defenders of the relics, veterans of Acre and Antioch, were reduced to flesh and guilt, their faith no shield against pain. The tortures were precise, legal in the twisted doctrines of inquisitorial law, designed not to seek truth but to extract words, admissions, syllables that could be twisted into the semblance of heresy, denials of Christ, spitting on the cross, obscene kisses at the base of the spine, worship of a severed head named Baphomet, blasphemies invented in the fever dreams of monarchs, and whispered through keyholes until they were accepted as divine certainty. And as the rack stretched their bones and hot irons kissed their feet, men who had faced down Saracen scimitars now broke beneath the instruments of Christian hands. Jacques de Molay, Grand Master, silent for days, finally confessed under pressure, not because he was guilty, but because truth means nothing when the body is torn from itself. And so across the land, hundreds of brothers, from seasoned commanders to humble initiates, signed their names to confessions they knew were lies, their eyes hollowed not just by pain, but by the realization that they had become relics sacrificed, not to preserve the faith, but to fill the coffers of a bankrupt king and silence the questions of a frightened church. And outside those prison walls, France carried on, cathedrals rang their bells, merchants sold spices, pilgrims walked the same roads, but the silence beneath the cities was a grave being dug with words, and each confession was another shovelful of earth cast onto a tomb whose stone would not bear their names. At the heart of this storm stood a man who should have been a shield, Pope Clement V, heir to St. Peter, vicar of Christ, but who, in the shadow of Philip IV's ambition, became instead a trembling reed bent by the wind of royal power, raised not in Rome but in Bordeaux, and seated in Avignon under the careful gaze of French soldiers. Clement was no lion, he was a dove placed in a cage of velvet and threats, surrounded by advisors whose tongues were half cloaked in silt, half dipped in poison. And as the accusations against the Templars flooded in like plague tide, confessions extracted from broken men, heresies painted in ink still wet with blood, Clement hesitated, stammered, doubted, and then, under pressure unbearable and persistent, yielded. He issued papal bulls suspending the order, not for proven guilt, but for the scandal their name now carried, a scandal manufactured by the king who coveted their wealth. The Pope convened councils, summoned theologians, promised justice, and yet every gesture of independence was shadowed by a king who held armies at his back and secrets in his archives. Philip threatened schism, accused Boniface VIII of heresy, and whispered of burning more than Templars if the Pope stood in his way. And so Clement, fearing the death of unity more than the death of innocence, became the architect of betrayal. In white robes, issuing the bull vox in excelso that dissolved the order not through proof, but by papal decree. And in that moment, the greatest spiritual institution of Christendom bowed not to God but to gold, not to faith but to fear. And the office of the papacy, which had once excommunicated emperors and stared down swords, now quietly extinguished one of its most devoted military arms without trial, without appeal, with a signature beneath the wax seal of complicity. It was not justice. It was survival, and history would remember it not as judgment, but as surrender wrapped in incense and smoke. The trials were never truly trials. They were performances written by fear, directed by power, and acted out upon broken men whose only crime had been loyalty to an order now deemed cursed by the very world it once defended. Held in secret chambers, some beneath churches, others inside stone towers damp with rot, the Templars were dragged one by one before inquisitors, whose pens were sharpened by torture, and whose eyes gleamed not with mercy but with command. Iron, chairs, heated tongs, bone-crushing wheels, the instruments of truth in a time where truth itself had become a weapon. And there, amidst cries muffled by gag and lash, the knights, noblemen, warriors, priests confessed to things no soul could imagine, spitting on crosses, worshipping false heads, obscene kisses, pagan rites, heresy sown like weeds through the holy soil of their vows. But these were not truths. They were the echoes of pain, the prayers of the desperate, the bargains of men who had watched comrades die screaming and knew the same awaited them unless they surrendered words instead of blood. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, stood fast for a time, refusing to confess, demanding a council, a hearing before the Pope, some measure of justice in a world now ruled by shadows. But even he, under the weight of weeks and chains, of isolation, of whispered promises and louder screams, gave in and confessed a confession he would later renounce with fire in his eyes and death at his heels. And all across France, from Paris to Toulouse to Poitiers, the same horror repeated: silent stone rooms, forced words, parchment soaked in the sweat of agony, until the myth of Templar guilt became doctrine, and the people, fed on sermons and fear, turned away from the very knights who once guarded their souls. The trial had never been about truth, it was about erasure, about rewriting history with fire and ink, about ensuring no blade, no oath, no voice remained to challenge the crown. And as the Templars fell, one by one, into disgrace and imprisonment, the silence around them grew louder than any defense they could offer, a silence curated, perfected, and sold to the world as divine justice, even as Templar brothers rotted in damp cells or stumbled out half alive with names they no longer recognized. Philip removed with the precision of a vulture who had scented his prize. Long before the first blow was struck, the treasure that had once passed through 100 Templar strongholds, gold from the Levant, relics from Jerusalem, scrolls written in lost tongues, and keys to fortresses whose stones remembered Saladin now sat sealed in the royal treasury, quietly absorbed into the veins of a kingdom whose debts had choked its court for decades. The king, ever draped in austerity, spoke of holy justice, yet behind the pulpit his scribes were busy assigning seized estates, melting down chalices for coin, and turning the Templar fleet into vessels of war for a crown that had never dared sail as far as Acre in Paris, the once hallowed temple precinct where knights had knelt in prayer and gold had been guarded with blood was now a royal prison, its sacred chapel desecrated by politics and greed. And what could not be taken physically, Philip sought to claim in spirit, rewriting charters, reassigning Templar lands to the Hospitallers with strings so thick they resembled shackles, making certain no future order could ever rise without royal oversight. France, once battered by war and rebellion, began to gleam again, but that gleam was not divine. It was molten, smelted from the betrayal of the purest warriors of Christendom. And as the public grew quieter, lulled by sermons that painted the Templars as corruptors and monsters, the king reshaped history in real time, commissioning clerics to write of sin and sorcery, while erasing the memory of sacrifice and valor. The people, hungry and tired, accepted the lies like bread, grateful to forget those who had once bled for them and foreign deserts. And in that forgetting, Philip won his final battle not with sword or gallows, but with ink, coin, and silence, building an empire on ghosts, and crowning himself with a golden wreath hammered from the ashes of those he damned. The square was filled with silence, not the peaceful kind, but that brutal quiet before execution, a hush thick with ash and dread, broken only by the clink of chains and the low murmur of priests, offering salvation to men already damned. It was March 18, 1314, and the setting sun cast long shadows over the El Dila site, where a pyre waited for two men who had once commanded armies, and safeguarded relics: Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, and Geoffrey de Charny, preceptor of Normandy, both dragged before the people like relics of a forgotten war. wearing tattered robes scorched with dust and pride. For years, Molay had suffered the slow torture of the Inquisition, forced confessions beneath red-hot irons, his name twisted into heresy by the same men who had once kissed his ring, but now, in the final hour, when given the chance to recant and live out his days in a cold cell, Molay instead raised his face to the heavens and spoke not of guilt, but of truth. He declared his innocence, denounced the lies, and called upon God himself to judge the crimes done in the name of the church and the people, who had long looked upon him with suspicion. Now saw something ancient in his eyes, not defiance, but a faith deeper than politics, a flame that refused to be extinguished. The flames took him slowly. Cruelly the wood was damp and the smoke thick. But Molay did not scream, did not beg. He stood upright, a silhouette against firelight, his voice echoing into the twilight, cursing the king and the pope, calling them to meet him before God's throne within the year. And so the fire burned, and the crowd watched not an execution, but a martyrdom, a final sermon without scripture, delivered by flesh turned ember. And when the smoke finally cleared, what remained was not silence, the legend a curse that would echo through palaces and pulpits, and a question that no amount of gold could smother. What if he had been telling the truth all along? It began, like a whisper in a cathedral low, uncertain, half-believed, and yet within a year of Jacques de Molay's execution, that whisper became a howl echoing through the marble halls of power, as if the fire that devoured the last Grand Master had set loose something no man could see but every man feared. For Molay's final words, spoken through smoke and agony, had not been plea nor prayer, but prophecy, a curse hurled at Pope Clement and King Philip, calling them to God's judgment within the year. And the world watched, waited, wondered, until it began. First came Clement, the weak pontiff who had betrayed the order in silence, struck down by a sudden illness, mere weeks after Molay's death, his body wasting like parchment soaked in oil, his final days haunted by fevered dreams of burning nights and collapsing altars. Then, as if summoned by divine symmetry, King Philip IV, the Iron King, fell next. While hunting in the forests, he had once claimed with royal arrogance, fell by a stroke at the height of his vigor, his mouth twisted in death as if trying to speak a final denial to a God no longer listening. Their deaths so swift, so eerie in their timing, sparked panic among the royal courts of Europe, and the curse of the Templars spread like black ink through the pages of every chronicler, whispered in abbeys, muttered in markets, that the wrath of the knights had outlived their bones, that justice had arrived not by sword, but by fate. And in the years that followed, the house of Capet, which had ruled France for centuries, collapsed like a rotted tower. Philip's sons, 3 kings in turn, each died without male heirs, their lines extinguished in scandal, infertility, and war, leading to the chaos of the 100 Years' War. Some called it coincidence, others divine retribution. But none could ignore the poetry of it, that the very king who burned the order for gold and silence had given birth to an era of fire and ruin. And so the name of Jacques de Molay, once buried beneath ash, now rose as a specter, not a forgotten martyr, but the man whose death cracked the throne and shook the papal tiara, proving that truth when burned does not die. It haunts after the flames died and the iron chains rusted, after the Grand Master's ashes blew through the alleys of Paris, like whispers too afraid to speak aloud. The Templar order, so rich, so feared, so vast, did not simply vanish. It fractured like stained glass under a hammer, splintered into silence and speculation. And from those splinters grew myths sharper than any sword. For though the papal bulls declared them disbanded, and Philip's gold-filled vaults now carried their name, something of the Templars remained in the wind, fugitives who fled across borders, hiding in cloisters, castles, and ships that bore no flag, brothers who vanished into Scotland, welcomed by lords who despised Rome, whispers that some carried with them ancient scrolls, arcane knowledge, and relics whose very mention could chill a bishop's blood. The church tried to erase them from the scrolls, But the people remembered, and they imagined secret underground orders, tunnels beneath Jerusalem, knights guarding the Holy Grail in the shadows of forgotten chapels, and every unexplained ruin, every enigmatic symbol etched into stone. Every sudden rise of a mysterious guild or society was pinned with trembling awe to the ghost of the Templars. Even as centuries passed and empires rose and fell, their name refused to die instead. It grew heavier, more mysterious, a canvas on which each age painted its own fears and longings. To the Enlightenment, they were symbols of suppressed knowledge. To revolutionaries, martyrs of tyranny. To occultists, gatekeepers of ancient rites. And in every corner of Europe, from crypt to cathedral, their red cross bled through the myths like wine through white linen. No longer bound by sword or church, the Templars became immortal not in flesh, but in legend, and in that legend, they wielded a power even kings could not kill. The power to haunt history itself, to become its ghost, its question, its shadow. Cast eternally across time's cathedral floor dot in the hollow left by the Order's destruction. A strange alchemy took place, for when flesh disappears, myth takes root, and over the centuries, the Templars became more than men, more than knights. They became a cipher, a mirror, a banner hoisted not by survivors but by successors of spirit, by men and movements, desperate to cloak themselves in the authority of ancient righteousness. Enlightenment thinkers, repelled by Rome's grip yet enthralled by esoteric legacy, reshaped the Templar memory into a symbol of forbidden wisdom, and thus, Masonic lodges across Europe whispered odes by candlelight and invoked the fallen knights as spiritual ancestors, inventing lineages as easily as history forgot them. In 18th century France, as revolution gathered like a thundercloud, radicals painted the Templars as martyrs of monarchy and tools of papal tyranny. Their ashes repurposed as sparks for a new fire of liberty. Napoleon's scholars trace supposed Templar connections through cryptic symbols in ancient cathedrals, while German romantics wrapped the order in Gothic mystery and Eastern mysticism. Even Hitler's SS, and its twisted hunger for historical legitimacy and pseudo-spiritual power, mimicked Templar rites and relic lore, and across the Atlantic, as America rose, secret societies born in ivy-covered halls began weaving the myth of Templar succession into the DNA of a new world order. They were no longer knights in white mantles, they were code names, passwords, sigils carved into the architecture of banks, governments, and ideologies. And in this transformation, the tragedy of the Templars was both diluted and elevated, for while the real men had burned, bled, and prayed, their afterimage was stripped of context and weaponized by generations, who needed a symbol more than they needed the truth. And so, the Order lived on not as warriors of Christ, but as shadows cast by those who claimed their light, echoing in conspiracy, ritual, and propaganda from Paris to Washington to Jerusalem, proving once again, it is not the sword that endures, but the story told after the sword is broken. While the fire consumed Paris and the gallows silenced its commanders, the story of the Knights Templar did not end in smoke and shame, for in the forgotten corners of Europe, on the ragged coastlines of Portugal, the highlands of Scotland, and the restless frontier of the Holy Roman Empire, embers still burned beneath cloaks of silence. These were the remnants, not the famous, not the powerful, but the faithful, the wounded, the exiled brothers who escaped the purge with forged names and hidden insignias, some aided by sympathetic nobles, others by the mercy of God or the chaos of war. In Portugal, King Diniz, ever the tactician, outwitted Rome by creating a new order, the Order of Christ, and absorbed the Templars whole into it, changing their name but not their purpose, preserving their ships, their codes, and their sacred mission under a different banner. And it was from these harbors that future explorers would sail, bearing crosses still red, but history's rebranded. In Scotland, where papal reach faltered and Robert the Bruce warred with both crown and cross, whispers emerged of Templar knights fighting in shadowed battles, their sigils sewn into tartans, their swords hidden in clan vaults, no longer an army, but a myth with muscle. In Germany, remnants folded into the Teutonic Knights or vanished into monastic obscurity, some turning to scholarship, others to silent warfare. And in the Levant, a few broken brothers remained behind, slipping into Eastern Christianity or vanishing into desert monasteries where Latin prayers echoed faintly against sandstone walls. What unified them all was not strategy nor strength, but the refusal to forget, a stubborn fidelity to vows made in better days, a belief that the order still lived, not in Rome's recognition or France's treasury, but in the brotherhood of the oath and the blood spilled to keep it. And so the Templars survived not as an army, but as an idea, too volatile to kill, too useful to discard, and too righteous or too dangerous to be left alone by either history or imagination. Death could not bury them. Fire could not silence them. As the world turned and centuries folded into dust, the Templars became more than memory, they became myth. An unfinished sentence echoing through the cathedrals of time, haunting kings and commoners alike. For though their banners were burned and their leaders scattered, Europe could not let them go. The suddenness of their fall, the secrets of their rituals, the gold that vanished without record, the charges whispered behind closed doors, all fed the wildfire of conspiracy that spread like ivy through the walls of monasteries, courts, and taverns. Some said they had escaped with their treasure to Scotland, where under Rosslyn Chapel they forged alliances that would one day birth Freemasonry. Others swore the order had sailed to the New World before Columbus, guided by arcane charts and divine prophecy, their red cross etched into cliffs where no European foot had yet tread. In Spain, in France, in Germany, local tales spoke of hooded knights appearing in battles long after their extinction, bearing strange relics, speaking forgotten prayers. The church, though silent, knew the power of symbols, and so did its enemies, and soon the Templar sigil was invoked by rebels, visionaries, revolutionaries, even occultists who whispered their legacy into arcane scripts and rites. Books emerged, claiming the Templars had guarded the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, or secret bloodline stretching back to Christ, and with every rumor, their myth grew richer, darker, deeper, like a tapestry woven from both history and hunger. In truth, most of the brothers died in prison or lived out their years in obscurity, stripped of weapons and dignity. Their stories erased, but their legend refused to die, because the Templars had not just built castles and banks, they had built a story, one forged in vows and fire, and that story unfinished, unresolved, made them immortal in the minds of men who could not bear to believe that such power could vanish without leaving behind a secret beneath the armor and beyond the battlefield. The Templars were not merely soldiers, they were architects of a new kind of power, one that fused the sacred and the profane, weaponized belief, and turned devotion into infrastructure. While monarchs ruled by birth and warlords by blood, the Templars ruled by divine trust, granted a papal exemption that made them untouchable. No taxes, no tithes, no king could command them, no bishop could judge them, and in this autonomy they forged an empire of stone and secrecy, spanning from the limestone shores of Acre to the frozen forests of England. They engineered a system where spiritual absolution came laced with ledger books, where a man could sin on the battlefield and be redeemed with coin deposited into Templar coffers. A system so elegantly corrupt, it seemed ordained. And as they built their fortresses, they also built influence, embedding agents in royal courts, managing funds for kings, underwriting crusades, and quietly influencing the decisions of empires. Theirs was a power both seen and unseen, a fortress flying, the red cross on the hill, and a sealed room beneath it where deals were made in Latin and gold. And in this machinery, we see the beating heart of medieval politics, a church that craved obedience, monarchs that craved legitimacy, and a knightly order that understood how to offer both for a price. But this balance was doomed from the start, for once a holy order begins to outgrow its spiritual leash, it becomes something heretical in the eyes of the very church that birthed it, and that, more than heresy or treasure, was the true sin the Templars would pay for, not what they did wrong, but how much they got right, how well they played the game, and how terrifying it was for the world to see piety and power in the same mailed fist. The air in Paris was thick with the smell of rot and smoke, not from battlefields, but from ledgers burned and oaths betrayed. And in the shadow of the temple fortress, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars, stood not as a conqueror, but as a relic waiting to be broken. Years of service, of silence, of sanctified obedience had brought him here, where parchment sealed by kings held more weight than 1,000 swords. On the morning of October 13, 1307, a Friday, forever cursed by what followed, the hammer came down. Across France, Templars were seized in their sleep, dragged from prayer into dungeons, accused not by evidence, but by ambition, tortured until lies became confessions, and in every cell the same unholy chant echoed: heresy, idolatry, blasphemy, sins born not from action, but from envy. And King Philip IV, drowning in debt to the order and desperate to seize their wealth, orchestrated the coup with surgical cruelty, backed by hand-picked inquisitors and a papacy too weak to resist. De Molay, once the most feared and respected knight in Christendom, was shackled, paraded like a beast, and forced to watch as his brothers were flayed in God's name. For 7 long years he languished, refusing to confess what was never true, his silence a blade sharper than any sword he'd ever drawn. And when at last they led him to the stake on the LD site, with Notre Dame rising behind him like a tombstone carved by heaven itself, he did not cry out. He looked to the sky, and with flames licking at his robes, he called down justice, not with vengeance but prophecy, condemning both Philip and Pope Clement to divine judgment before the year's end. As the pyre consumed him, it was not a man that died, but a myth reborn in fire, for the Templars did not vanish the day. They melted into legend, into whispers, into the ink-stained pages of forbidden books, where power never truly dies. It only changes its name. The air in Paris was thick with the smell of rot, and smoke not from battlefields, but from ledgers burned and oaths betrayed. And in the shadow of the temple fortress, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars, stood not as a conqueror, but as a relic waiting to be broken. Years of service, of silence, of sanctified obedience had brought him here, where parchment sealed by kings held more weight than 1,000 swords. On the morning of October 13, 1307, a Friday, forever cursed by what followed, the hammer came down. Across France, Templars were seized in their sleep, dragged from prayer into dungeons, accused not by evidence, but by ambition, tortured until lies became confessions, and in every cell the same unholy chant echoed: heresy, idolatry, blasphemy, sins born not from action, but from envy. And King Philip IV, drowning in debt to the order and desperate to seize their wealth, orchestrated the coup with surgical cruelty, backed by hand-picked inquisitors and a papacy too weak to resist. De Molay, once the most feared and respected knight in Christendom, was shackled, paraded like a beast, and forced to watch as his brothers were flayed in God's name. For 7 long years he languished, refusing to confess what was never true, his silence a blade sharper than any sword he'd ever drawn. And when at last they led him to the stake on the LD site, with Notre Dame rising behind him like a tombstone carved by heaven itself, he did not cry out. He looked to the sky, and with flames licking at his robes, he called down justice, not with vengeance but prophecy, condemning both Philip and Pope Clement to divine judgment before the year's end. As the pyre consumed him, it was not a man that died, but a myth reborn in fire, for the Templars did not vanish the day. They melted into legend, into whispers, into the ink-stained pages of forbidden books, where power never truly dies. It only changes its name. In the weeks that followed Jacques de Molay's execution, the smoke had barely cleared from the pyre before the parchments began to rewrite the world. not with swords, but with silence. Royal scribes and Vatican secretariats moved like undertakers over a battlefield, burying the bones of the Templars beneath legales, papal bulls, and carefully curated forgetfulness. Philip IV, hollow-eyed and restless in his palace, felt the curse tighten around his court as sudden deaths and scandals haunted his bloodline. His sons unraveling into scandal and madness, his dynasty rotting before it could blossom. And far from Paris, in the cloisters of Avignon, Pope Clement V faded into obscurity, racked by illness and political guilt, haunted by the betrayal of a brotherhood he had once blessed with holy oil. The Vatican archives, heavy with secrets, sealed away the chin and parchment, a document that absolved the Templars even as they burned, and buried it so deep that centuries would pass before its ink saw light again. The Church, needing a scapegoat but fearing a martyr, painted the Templars as shadows of what they were: greedy, corrupt, seduced by Eastern mysticism. Unmoored from Rome, but it was a narrative stitched from the cloth of fear and debt, not truth. Across Europe, the lands once marked by the Red Cross of the Templars were seized, divided, or abandoned, their castles emptied, their vaults raided, their relics vanished into smoke and myth. And yet, from Portugal to Scotland, whispers persisted that some knights had escaped, the treasure had been hidden, that symbols etched in ancient stone pointed to a truth the Church could not kill. And so, in the centuries that followed, the order that had once guarded pilgrims and crushed empires became a ghost resurrected by Freemasons, hunted by kings, mythologized by poets, feared by tyrants, a cipher that empires invoked when the line between faith and power blurred too sharply. In the absence of answers, legend took root, and the Templars, once flesh and steel, became something eternal, the dream of a righteous sword tempered by silence, and the warning that even the holiest warriors can be devoured by the very kings they served long after their banners were torn and their ashes scattered to the wind. The ghosts of the Templars began to whisper through the vaulted halls of European power, not as martyrs, but as a code, a warning, a riddle etched into architecture and ritual, half remembered by monarchs, heretics, and revolutionaries alike. In the Age of Enlightenment, as kings fell to the guillotine and new republics carved their futures from ancient bones, the image of the Templar knight stoic, betrayed, bound to a higher law, was resurrected not by the Church but by those who sought to defy it. Freemasons traced their lineage to the order, weaving symbols of square and compass with the sword and the cross, creating temples of reason where whispers of Jerusalem still echoed beneath marble floors, and candlelit oaths in revolutionary France where the blood of kings watered the streets. Robespierre and his brethren invoked Templar justice against the tyranny of crowns, believing they were finishing a war the Church had buried in the New World across oceans. The Templars had never sailed. Their myth arrived nonetheless, carried in secret lodges and the design of Capitol domes, in the iconography of the dollar bill and the architecture of power built on secrecy and sacrifice. They became a mirror for every insurgent who imagined himself righteous, for every tyrant who feared betrayal cloaked in faith, for every historian who searched ruins for answers and found symbols instead. And so the Templars endured not as saints or demons, but as shadows that stretched across centuries, pulled into conspiracy and cinema, textbooks and tombs, distorted by time yet never fully erased. Their legacy became a skeleton key for understanding the quiet war between power and principle, wealth and worth, loyalty and truth. And though they left behind no heir, no flag, no final word, their silence became prophecy that in every age, men would rise who claimed divine purpose yet feared the justice of their own servants. And in that tension, the soul of every empire would be tested again, so it ended not in war, but in fire, not on the battlefield, but in the square of public shame, where the last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, stood with wrists bound, the Seine behind him and Notre Dame before, a martyr not to faith but to betrayal. And as the flames climbed, and the crowd murmured, and the king turned his eyes away, Molay shouted no curse, no confession, but only a calm defiance that echoed like thunder through the cathedrals of Europe. That Pope Clement and King Philip would meet him before God within the year, and they did. And yet, this is not a tale of vengeance fulfilled, but of something older, crueler, and more eternal. The moment when institutions devour their own, when power turns upon the very hands that build it, when silence becomes justice's final defense. For the Templars were not merely destroyed, they were erased, disbanded not only from maps but from memory, their properties absorbed, their oaths condemned, their records scattered to rot or secrecy. And yet, they haunt us still, not as heroes or heretics, but as a warning, carved into history's spine like a scar that every empire, no matter how gilded, how righteous, how sanctified by ritual or gold or holy writ, carries within it the seeds of its own silence. The Templars rose by sword and scripture, and they fell by politics and pride. And in that fall lies the tragic truth of every great power. It is not the blade or the flame that kills, but the moment it forgets why it was born. This was the empire of gold and silence, and in its ruin, we see not only the echoes of knights long turned to dust, but the mirror of our own age, still asking, who watches the watchman when the altar becomes the throne, and justice is the heresy of the brave?